If you're interested in decoding the complexities of China's national security outlook and its military modernization, check out Takshashila's latest expert capsule course offering China's Defense in the New Era. Visit school.takshashila.org.in and enroll in the course today.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy, your favorite daily public policy podcast from the Takshashila Institution. I'm Anushka Saxena, staff research analyst with the institution's Indo-Pacific Studies program. And my guest on this episode is Shobhankita Reddy, my colleague from the High-Tech Geopolitics program of Takshashila. Welcome to the episode, Shobhankita.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Anushka.
Right. The news cycle is rife with content and rumor on the latest export restrictions placed by China on the exports of some rare earth elements, some heavy metals. And, this is kind of an extension. It came about on the 9th of October, and it's an extension of the export restrictions we saw in April. That time, I think the coverage was on some 7 rare earth elements, and some of them have uses in the form of magnets. And now we've seen 9 more joined into the list. But that's not all that this list released by the Ministry of Commerce of China includes. There is inclusion of samarium-related goods, other a content that is of Chinese origin that can be used for metallurgical purposes and ultimately have applications in national security related domains, say defense, semiconductor production, so on and so forth. And obviously, all countries, governments and academics are debating the implications. They're thinking about how this is going to impact their own nation's interests. And of course, what is the way out of this, right? Is this China really trying to exercise all the leverage it has in the market? Because it's no surprise to any of us that 90% of the processing and separation vertical of the rare earth supply chain has China written all over it? Or is it just, another symbolic maneuver to get some concessions out of, say, the West and the US in particular? And, at the outset, I would really love to start this conversation with making a big, bold statement. And then, in the course of this conversation, we could either confirm it or deny it, which is that China seems to itself be making China+1 a reality. Not too many benefits to this move seem evident, at least at this juncture, even if in the short term it might lead to inflations, and not just in terms of prices, but in terms of egos and leverages and concessions during negotiations as well. But as we have seen multiple times in previous cases, let's say with real estate in China or with manufacturing in the US, some of these kind of inflated things come crashing down heavily and pop like bubbles sometimes as well. So in this conversation, again, we're going to do a little bit of a discussion on these latest regulations, which, by the way, come into effect on December 1. So I think we're timely in discussing this, but we also may, see different implications down the line. We might even see them revoked. Who knows? But in this conversation, we're going to discuss the regulations themselves, do a little bit of a background check on what motivates China to undertake a maneuver like this. And sitting here in Bangalore, we're going to think about how they impact India. And if at all they do, what are the next steps, as it were, right? So welcome again, Shobhankita. And without further ado, if I can just begin by asking you, what stood out to you in the October 9 legislation or regulation, as it were? There are some provisions on what exporters, producers, intellectual property rights holders are required to do, how governments are supposed to act vis a vis Chinese origin rare earths. And of course, then there's an annexure which talks about the new listed items that have a huge oversight on them now going forward. So what are those provisions and what are the key takeaways that you have from these?
Yeah.
Over to you.
Yeah. So 5 new elements have been added, and this is on top of the 7 elements that were previously, the 7 rare earth elements and magnets that were previously added. And let's not forget that starting in July 2023, this has been a progression. So July 2023, China instituted export controls on gallium and germanium. By December, export licenses were required for graphite and other hard metals. By April 2025, it was 7 rare earth elements and magnets. And now we see further 5 elements, again rare earths, and samarium related technologies, like you said, but also technologies required or anything that has been made with Chinese technology as they define it. There's also a requirement now for foreign companies to obtain licenses in order to export products that have anywhere above 0.1% of any of these metals. So again, very, very stringent. So you can imagine the kind of bureaucratic machinery that would be required inside of China if they were to seriously implement any of this. And it's hard not to make the case that this would actually hurt Chinese industry as well, because the other provision actually is that this is applicable not just for foreign companies, but also domestic Chinese companies that may be doing re-exporting. So first is the end use purpose. That needs to be cleared by the Ministry of Commerce in China, which is to ensure that it's not being used for military and it's only being used for civilian applications. So that end use declaration and certificate needs to go through. But at the same time, in any case where domestic exporters would need to re-export, then again, also there are requirements on them to go through these processes. So again, like you were saying, firstly, this is not the first time that China has done this. This has been a progression the last 2 years. But even outside of this episode, this is not the first time that China has done this. Back in 2010, we had a Senkaku Island issue that blew up between China and Japan. And this was actually not the Chinese government or port authorities doing this. This was actually a few folks at the port who decided to take matters into their own hand when a fisherman from China was arrested by the Japanese Coast Guard. And what's different from that time to this is that this is a state led embargo. This is China willing and continuously showing its ability and intent to institute bureaucratic machinery and to go through with this as a strategic leverage against the US. And the way this has been instituted gives it a form of semi-permanence. And we had said this when this happened, even in June, July, that despite the potential for a deal between US and China, and potentially now that we have the exports of some of these since August coming into India as well, post the high level meeting between Jaishankar and the foreign affairs minister in China, we saw that this is a card that China could anytime use. And this is exactly what's happening, right? And to your point on China +1 becoming a reality, I agree with that. I feel that what happened post 2010 is that markets really reacted, because even though this was a few port folks, blocking the export of a few shipments that were going towards Japan, and they so happened to be rare earths at that time, this still blew up in the New York Times and in the West as a state-led embargo. And embargo is a serious thing, and it didn't happen back then in 2010. And still we had markets react. Prices went up. For example, we saw the prices of dysprosium actually go up 2,000% or something like that. So it was crazy, right? So we had from 2000 to 2010, China actually export quotas were being instituted. And the reason China said this was because they wanted to ensure that these strategic reserves were being maintained. It was not environmentally polluting to the mines where people in China were suffering. So in 2010, when this issue with Japan blew up and the prices of dysprosium, for example, and a few others actually just quickly shot up, if you compare pre-2010 and post-2010, Chinese dominance has actually come down. So if today we think that in some metals, Chinese dominance is close to 90%, it was actually higher previously. So now it's about 70 to 90%, depending on which mineral and metal you take. But previously it was much higher. So we see that in the short term, this could be a strategic leverage card that China can play, and it is willing to play. And it makes sense why China would do this, because setting up a new mine takes 16 years. Getting the stockpiles required through diplomatic measures takes time. Some of these are also so short term because they are difficult to stockpile, or the prices are not, private players are not willing to stockpile on these, or pass on the high cost to their downstream consumers. That continuous, consistent supply of these would be required. So in these scenarios, it makes sense for China to do this. But again, this is a short-term gain for a long-term loss, which is that I completely expect that over the next 15, 20 years, Chinese dominance would yet again come down, as we saw in the 2010 scenario.
That's really interesting, Shubhankita, because China is really playing at the margins here. It's not only, as you said, expressing its intent and willingness to weaponize whatever leverage it may have or thinks it may have, and it's outrightly calling out any applications in the military domain with a playbook, and it all seems to be a part of a playbook which is very similar to what perhaps the US has been exercising vis-a-vis China. And now, if we go into the conversation about who did it first, it will be like the chicken and egg problem. And yet, you see that there is an expression of intent to retaliate in the same language or currency that the US would understand and perhaps use with China in Beijing today. And that's precisely why, and this is just me, but I feel like that's precisely why even 0.1% of Chinese origin rare earths being used in magnet making technologies or in refining or in re export seems like a good idea, at least from what is evident in these regulations. And the flagging and the targeting, the extensive licensing requirements that will come with this, like you rightly said, will not only make for a lot of frustration and panic reaction, but also for intensive oiling within parts of the bureaucratic machinery, which again China will have its own problems with, and it has had those in the past. And this is just about the model on which the Communist Party works, right? Which is that if you're the governor of a province, or if you're the political commissar of a province for 2-3 years, you want to do big beautiful projects, and to use Trump's language, and you want to move on, and by the time the drastic implications of that are evident, you've moved on to a higher posting because you did something that immediately caught the eye of the supervisors. So it also has a lot to do with efficiency, removal of formalization, the patron client system. So there's also a lot of political problems this is likely to throw up within China, and it's a shame to see that it's being short-sighted this way. And this time it's actually a state embargo. So, like you said, that makes it a lot worse. And that point about it being an official embargo also brings in the idea of lawfare, right? So leverage and lawfare, which would mean that there are incremental moves, like you said, since maybe 2010 to July 2023 to April 2025 to today, where you want to keep formalizing and codifying these restrictions and keep incrementally making them worse, so that it's somewhere in the official rule book that, look, this is something that's denied. And even though they've come out with some statements saying that this is not a ban, not targeted at any country, it's classic rhetoric from China, right? But actually what it does is that it creates these extensive requirements that almost feel like a ban, and that again will, like you said, create challenges in the long term. But Shavankita, so tell me this: what is your assessment of whether there is leverage here? Firstly, I think if we take a step back and zoom out, could you lay the land for our listeners, as it were, and talk a little bit about what the Chinese ecosystem looks like? And or maybe to zoom out a little bit more, let's first start by talking about rare earths themselves. What makes them so critical? Some say data is the new oil, water is the new oil, the next war is going to be fought over semiconductors. Do you think that's the case? Are critical minerals or rare earths in specific the new oil from your perspective? And then how is it that we've come to know China as this dominant player in this ecosystem?
Yeah. So let's be firstly very clear that rare earths are not rare in the Earth's crust. Geographically, they're just not rare. In quantity, they're not rare. Actually, there's exactly that much amount of these rare earths in the Earth's crust as there is of copper or even gold. But the problem with rare earths is that they are a much higher quantity of the Earth's crust is needed to be dug up to process the same quantity of these rare earths as compared to most other metals that you wouldn't otherwise classify as rare. So it's just the logistical, the operational, the environmental pollution externality that these cause. But purely by their numbers, their quantities, they're not rare. Also, they are required in such small quantities in all of the applications that we see, right? Your phone has a rare earth, otherwise it wouldn't buzz, otherwise it wouldn't vibrate. So pretty much everything in our modern day life today has a rare earth element to it. And we have figured out ways to make most of our devices compact because there is a rare earth magnet that enables that efficiency in these devices, right? So you're you require these rare earths in very, very small quantities. Firstly, that's one. Secondly, the cost of these rare earths that go into any of these devices is also very, very small. We know today that for a regular two-wheeler Ather vehicle, the cost of a rare earth magnet is very, very low, like not more than 1,000 rupees. And it's possible for that to be absorbed by the private player themselves without requiring even state subsidy, right? So firstly, the quantities required are very, very small. For example, gallium, despite the export control since July 2023, the data for US imports of gallium is about 150,000 kgs a year. This is something that can easily fit into 3 truckloads. So if you can stockpile your year's worth of critical minerals in 3 truckloads, then it's not really that much of a strategic leverage. Although this is not true for some other materials, but specifically about gallium, it would be. So the point being, I would disagree that critical minerals are the oil of this decade because wars have been fought over oil, and oil, uh, by its nature, is a fuel. Critical minerals are materials, and a fuel needs to be burnt for its value to be derived. Versus a material can be reused, can be stored, can be recycled. So there's a whole bunch of things you can do with materials that you can't do with oil. At the same time, just the quantity, like I kept harboring upon, the quantity of critical minerals or rare earths that you need for any of your applications, it's so small that it's hard to imagine the kind of inflationary economy-wide implications that critical mineral access or even price difference could cause the same way that oil would, right? So clearly, on these grounds, quantity used, storage capacity, impact on overall economy, the fact that they're materials while oil is a fuel and hence needs to be spent and hence discarded, there is a difference. So I would disagree that critical minerals are the oil of this decade. But I think it's become kind of sexy, as it were, to prop them up as this great strategic national asset. And of course, we live in a time where technology is securitized. And so we don't just see this in critical minerals, but pretty much in every technology, we see this inclination for export controls. We see this inclination for tech denial. But that's just the times that we live in. It's not specific to the technology in itself, I would argue.
Right. And yet it does seem that way, that in the Chinese mind or in Beijing's mind, their classification of rare earths as this, like you said, national strategic asset. And, even on these, some countries call it critical minerals, some call them strategic minerals. Broadly, we understand what the list entails or could entail, right? So the Chinese are clearly seeing endless possibilities here of what they can do with it and how they can leverage it. And I think some of this is also reactive in that, because technology is not only securitized and weaponized, but also very much today at the core and the center of a very dynamic geopolitical and geoeconomic environment. it has also become sexy, as it were, to use technological tools for attack and counter attack. And as a global trend, if you see, you have the October 7 export control rules from the US, you have alliances being built around technology denial, you have technological sovereignty becoming a national strategy, you have this clear distinction in exports on what can be military use and what can be civilian use. So the technological component has become just too central to trade, to geopolitics, and even diplomacy, right? And we've been having these conversations at Takshashila a lot lately, but it's going beyond just the realm of the Earth's crust to even outer space, and I'm sure there's a rare earth element to be used somewhere there, right?
Yeah.
So,
and there is, in fact,
yeah.
I mean, early this year, Trump spoke about potentially acquiring Greenland, and the reason he at least so-called claimed was that it had, it was a gold mine of critical mineral resources. Similarly, with Ukraine, the deal that eventually fell apart had a critical mineral element to it. And we are not short of people who claim that deep sea mining or lunar mining is a good idea. But if you actually look at the economics of it, it's actually very, very difficult to pull off. Imagine having to go all the way to moon, mine these minerals, firstly set up a new mine, let alone that a new mine in Earth takes about 16 years, to have to go to moon, set up a new mine there, and then logistically bring them back, ensuring that these costs are still commensurate for downstream applications and eventually for the end consumer to be willing to pay for these costs, right? So clearly, so I contend that much of the critical mineral stock that we saw early this year was actually just a way for nation states to have or claim a strategic interest in something that they were otherwise anyway interested in. It had nothing to do with critical minerals. Or sometimes I also wonder if this has something to do with the fact that we live in a time of increased defense spending, and many of these minerals actually co-occur in the Earth's crust with radioactive elements or elements that are used in military applications. So sometimes I think all this hype for critical minerals, is it, and again, I'm being speculative here, but is it actually to do with the military use cases versus civilian use cases? So I feel like the ground was set in terms of global hype for these minerals, and these are not properly understood. And many of these minerals, as you will know, are a mouthful just to pronounce. So it becomes all the more sexy to call them these critical minerals. And you will see that nation state to nation state lists vary. In some, lithium is a critical mineral, in others, it's not. And honestly, both the India and the US lists have almost 40% of the periodic table listed out as critical minerals. Like, how does that make sense, right? So clearly, I see some paradoxes here. But I think for China to do this from their perspective makes complete sense. And for them to also, gone is the time where China could position itself as a victim of the global world order, right? I mean, today, Chinese overcapacity is one problem. China's willingness to, maneuver through the WTO rules is another. This is yet another where its dominance is being used. But again, this is again, like you said, the playbook that the US previously used, and China itself has an unreliable entity list, and it maintains the same kind of architecture that it has actually exactly copied from the US.
Yeah. No, that's really fascinating stuff, Shobhankita, because and this is quite a TIL for me, because if critical minerals could potentially be proven to be a charade to actually mine radioactive elements, that's something completely different. It's a theoretical perspective that I'd really want the listeners to ponder upon. But jokes aside, I think this is serious talk, because obviously there are going to be implications, even if it is in the short term. So first, I wanted to understand from you, what in general are the alternatives? What can countries do that are trying to navigate around these export restrictions and rules in the short term till December 1, maybe? What are the things they can wrangle with, and in the short term? And of course, what methods? We hear way too much about diversification and finding alternatives, but let's face it, if there was an alternative to the economies of scales of separation and processing that existed in China, I'm pretty sure 1 out of 194 governments in the world would have invested massively in it, right? So, what are the realistic alternatives in your mind in that regard? And to follow on with that, what implications do you see for India?
Yeah. So let me first talk about what I think is the structural problem here. Firstly, the value chain today is so difficult to be completely uprooted from one country and diversified into another that it's an all hands on deck problem, and yet no guarantee for a solution, because China got this good over 30 years. Right, just as China became the manufacturing powerhouse of the world, the West was happy to outsource environmental pollution to China, and similarly, the entire critical mineral mining, processing, value-added manufacturing, recycling has actually completely moved to China, more or less, right? 70 to 90%, as we were talking about. At one point in time, China had, even today, almost 40% of all rare earths come from one mine in China in the Inner Mongolia region. At one point in time, China realized, as per capita GDP inside China grew, that this was a problem because, many villages in Inner Mongolia were being called cancer villages because, people would struggle with just these radioactive minerals and mining and pollution and diseases of all kinds. And they decided to then outsource this environmental pollution to other countries that were willing to absorb this. And that happened to be countries in Latin America, countries like Myanmar, right? So today, China is actually a net importer of a lot of these minerals, raw materials. And what they do today is actually the high-end stuff, which is value-added manufacturing, processing, and recycling. Now, that's hard to beat because firstly, they own a lot of mines. And secondly, they have invested in technology, R&D over decades to actually, really have a monopoly over this at this point in time. So the challenge for stakeholders globally is firstly that private player incentive is very, very less because it's very expensive. The capex required, the upfront costs required are almost dissuading private players to invest in this. The long timelines as well, like I said. At the same time, as long as this is a switch that China can choose to turn on and switch off, again, there is no guarantee for private players globally to be investing for long term in this sector. And we see early signs of this changing, right? Like, for example, MP Materials, this company that the US government took a stake in and guaranteed procurement with a price. With a guaranteed price that is known to be above market price. So, we see this government push. So clearly, government subsidies and procurement guarantees and so on are required. And yet that is no guarantee because of the structural problems and the dominance that China has had. Right? For example, processing of some of these minerals is hard. And figuring that out, setting up all of these plans is going to take a few years' time. And meanwhile, the rest of all your industries depend on these input materials. So what are you going to do, right? So I think that is the problem that we are in. Having said that, I think the single most feature to watch is the price. Because if prices of these minerals go up, as we expect them to in the short term, and some of these minerals already have been seeing slight linear price increases, and some don't, and I'll come to that in some time. But really, if prices increase disproportionately, alternatives suddenly look economically feasible. And to your question on what some of these alternatives could be, so there are different ways you can substitute these in your applications, right? Firstly, you can do a material for material substitution. For example, you can use iron or manganese instead of cobalt in batteries. So purely from a material perspective, you take away one material, put another. That's one. The second is system for system substitution, which is you replace, for example, lithium ion batteries with hydrogen fuel cells. It takes a different technology, but still, a system for system substitution that still makes sense for the grander product or application that you have. The other might be process for process substitution, where instead of mining new technologies or new minerals, you recycle current, you recycle critical minerals from existing products. The other is you can look for efficiency improvements. You can use less rare earths and magnets through better design, through better product design efficiency and things like that. So there are different ways you can look at substitution, but unfortunately today none of these, for the applications that we see around us, are an exact match. There are always trade-offs, either in cost, and that's to be expected, but there are also trade-offs in terms of efficiency, in terms of size, because remember, much of our modern devices are compact. And the best thing about some of these minerals is that they make these magnets so powerful that you can make them this compact. So that goes away if you were to substitute and have either cost or technical efficiency or some other efficiency optimization as a trade-off. So I think that's a problem. But again, remember that this is not actually in Chinese interest that other countries diversify, because as gallium, germanium, and all of these minerals have been getting into Chinese export control lists, parallelly what's happened is that the price of lithium has crashed. Right. And this is, again, one of those minerals where China exports large quantities of. And so it hurts China to actually block its own exports of such large quantities, because the industry in China is also a political economy. And it's not in the business interests of China to do this, for the government to do this. Right. So I think that's the paradox there. As long as China can continue to dangle this as a tool that they can turn on and switch off as they wish, depending on what the state of the negotiations with the US on what percentage of tariff to be imposed by Trump is, we see that there's going to be less incentive for private players to jump in, as much as there's a push for governments to do that. But as long as prices rise, and and rare earths is a perfect example of this, because unlike in lithium where prices are crashing, rare earths are required in small quantities. And so the export of these minerals doesn't actually hurt China that much, right? Because they're required in small quantities, small value, they're not too expensive, they're important, and they're necessary for many applications. But just by price and quantity, they don't have a high stake in terms of Chinese exports. So that way, rare earths are a perfect fit in terms of where you hurt others without necessarily hurting yourself too much. But in the long term, what can happen, and what I contend will happen, is that other countries, having experienced this for the last 2 years with China, will go on to diversify. And India has already been doing this, for example, with recently setting up a national critical mineral stockpile. And in the short term, we need a stockpile, right? And this is along with other countries, diplomatic engagements, ties with other friends who believe that this also hurts their interests, and also to weaken the Chinese monopoly, as it were. But I think the other thing that the Indian reforms and regulatory environment requires is that we need to have a better regulatory framework to do this. Firstly, IREL cannot be the monopoly for rare earths. We need more private player entry. And even if that has happened, we see that the way the exploration licenses are set up, it's actually disincentivizing people from jumping the gun and taking on these export licenses, because your gains from exploring and processing are contingent on the final mining being successful, right? So because of that risk element, again, we see that not enough people, not enough private players are exploring and taking upon these exploration licenses. So I think our house is not in order. That's firstly a long-term domestic private player entry and reforms that we need to undertake. But at the same time, stockpiling, diplomatic engagements, all of that are important. I would say one thing that's necessary while we do these diplomatic engagements is to ensure that we don't end up becoming the supplier of raw materials or just an importer of final value added goods. What we need through these diplomatic engagements is also technology transfer, is also joint R&D collaborations, is capability building that will go the long mile and actually serve our interests, instead of essentially just taping over some short-term problems while the structural problems remain.
Yeah, look, that's an excellent perspective and very comprehensive analysis on this, Shobhankita, because, and I'm just thinking here from the Indian perspective, when in April, China had introduced that list of 7 kind of export restricted rare earth elements and magnets, Around that time, Indian firms like Bajaj and other EV manufacturers, automobile manufacturers started making the case that look, with these restrictions in place, even if there's a quote unquote thaw or the upcoming existence of a bonhomie between India and China, it's going to take 40 to 45 days for them to be able to secure a contract that meets with all the compliance and IP related criteria of the April regulations, right, in China. And if this time the list is wider and the criteria is at the margin, 0.1% of anything, right? So it could take a month, it could take 2 months, and even as we stockpile in that period, the alternatives for us domestically or even in the world have timelines that are much longer than 2 months, right? And so action has to be now. And so in this regard, I think a lot of this should also mean, of course, you talked about how the house needs to come into order, and there's a lot of reforms on that front, but a lot of this also should speak to those and temper the expectations of those who say that, look, India is not going to be impacted because China is trying to build relations in a positive direction, because that's not going to happen, because China has repeatedly, because both the arguments that China wants a thaw with India and that China has shown its intent to weaponize technology cannot coexist. China can only be one type of an actor, and even if in the medium term it wants some degree of stability, does not either mean that India will be exempt from some of these things, especially as a major re-exporter alongside Taiwan, or if it may not come. It may not become a victim of some of these things down the line in the future, even if relations otherwise are stable. And of course, this also doesn't mean that more Chinese investments or more Chinese interest in having India be that viable alternative to China+1 exists, right? I don't think it does. And so India may want to position itself as much as it wants, but there are real meaningful reforms that need to be taken before it can do that, or it can continue to import from China, and then whatever concessions that asks for, you be ready to pay for those, right? So both options available. This is not to say, it is not to advocate for self-reliance or over-dependency, but it's about national interest, and ultimately it's about consumer welfare, right? Yeah.
Which is why I think in the immediate term, prior to December 1st, I think this is a political negotiation between Beijing and Delhi, right? This is not private sector interests in both the countries actually coming at it with each other. This is actually the state.
Yeah.
And hence, I think it's reasonable for automobile manufacturers and EV manufacturers and everything else in Indian industry to expect that this is also a political negotiation that is taken forward by Delhi.
Yeah. And of course, India has a vibrant culture of lobbying. So let's see where that takes us. But thank you so much once again, Shobhankita, for all of your insights today. I think this has been a fascinating chat, timely, and also peering into the future as 2 months down the line, little less than 2 months down the line, we find out whether China rolls back on these or expands on them incrementally in the face of how negotiations with the US go. So thanks again. And thank you also to our listeners for tuning into this episode of All Things Policy. If you're excited to know a little bit more about China's thinking on a bunch of these things, especially on national security, defense, and military modernization, please do check out the latest executive capsule course offering of the Takshashila Institution, China's Defense in the New Era. Please visit school.takshashila.org.in and enroll in the course if it interests you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Anushka.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.